This is one of 3 shop-made stops used for cutting tenons. It's just a piece of scrap plywood. I got a couple of 1/4 by 20 cap head screws going through and fastened to those T-track nuts. It is relieved, notice, so that the sliding bar doesn't create friction. Well, here I've got the 3 stops mounted to the router boss. You'll notice that the one in the middle is different from the other 2. The block on the right I've mounted to the bottom T-track of the router boss. Once I position it, I'll clamp it down and it won't move anymore. The one in the middle, however, is mounted to the bottom track of the sliding bar, and it needs to be able to move back and forth with the sliding bar. The one on the left is just like the one on the right, and once we position it in the bottom track of the router boss, then it's going to be fixed in place and not move. On this tenon, I want a 1/4 inch left and right shoulder. So what I'm going to do is plunge the router bit and then contact the edge of the router bit, the cutting edge, with the side of the workpiece there. That gives me a 0 position, and now I'm going to crank the DRO until I get about a 1/4 inch. 248 here is close enough to 250. So I've got a 1/4 of an inch, and now I can go ahead and set one of my stops to capture that movement. The way I'll do this is to be sure and take the leftmost stop and slide it as far as I can to the left on the base of the router boss there. I'm going to put it there and then clamp it down. Now notice I'm using the left stop because I'm marking a position for the right side of the workpiece. So if you keep that in mind, left and right always go together. So now I'll slide the center stop over and butt it against that left stop and tighten it securely to the sliding bar. I've now captured one dimension. Now I'm going to traverse the bar and do the same thing by zeroing my router bit against the left edge of the workpiece. And now since I'm on the left edge of the workpiece, I'll be using the right stop. Try and remember that the left part of the workpiece goes with the right DRO stop. So now I've zeroed the DRO. I'm going to travel in a 1/4 of an inch, and then I'm going to set that right-hand stop. Once you do this, you'll understand what I'm talking about. It can be a little confusing, left and right and so forth, but once you'll do it, you'll see why you have to do it this way. So there's my 1/4 of an inch. Now I can go down and not move the sliding bar. Notice how it's traveled now away from where I left it. Now I'm going to bring that other stop over to my center stop, and I'm going to lock it in place. So what the left and the right stop have done now, they've given me the limits of the cutter. That's as far to the left as it'll go and as far to the right. And what the piece in the middle is going to do, of course, is going to represent the travel of the workpiece. It can go that far to the left and it can go that far to the right. I don't have to watch it. I'll feel the bump and I'll know I'm all the way there. It's always good, of course, to look down and sneak a peek and see what you're doing. So here's what it looks like underneath the base plate. You can see the wood traversing against those stops to the right and then to the left. So let's go ahead and set the y-axis now, the in and out or the north-south axis of the router boss. I'll go to the far side of the workpiece there and touch the cutting edge of my bit to that face of the workpiece. Then I'm going to come down to my DRO and set it to 0. Now I want an 1/8 inch shoulder in this case for this slat that I'm making, so I'm going to move the router towards me 1/8 of an inch. As soon as I get to 1/8 of an inch, I'm going to set a stop, one of the precision stops, up against the round bar that is attached to my DRO reader bar there. And I'll push the stop up against it and set it down tight, and that tells me that's as far back as I can go and cut 1/8 of an inch off the back side of that workpiece. Now I want to do the same thing to the front side because I'm going to cut 1/8 inch off the front as well. So I plunge the router, I get my cutting edge of the bit to touch the front face of the workpiece, I zero the DRO, and now I push it away from me into the workpiece 1/8 of an inch. And there I've got 1/8 of an inch, and I'm ready to set the other precision stop. I'll bump it up against the round bar and lock it down tight. Now the gap you see there represents the distance my router will travel to cut 1/8 of an inch off the back and 1/8 of an inch off the front of my slat. They're nice and tight, they won't move. Well, we can also set the y-axis, the north-south axis, using gauge blocks. You may prefer that. In fact, you might not want the DRO. So here's how we're going to do it. We'll get our reference off the back face of the workpiece again. Once we have that, we'll slide a precision stop up to the round bar and lock it down. Then I'm just going to pull the router away from that precision stop, and I'm going to place in whatever gauge block I want. It may be 1/8, it may be 1/4, it can be whatever you want, or it can be a series of blocks. I'll place that in, and now I'm going to loosen the precision stop, and without moving the router, I'll just slide that stop forward. Now I've effectively got it where I want it to be to cut that back shoulder. The same process is used on the front. Here you can see I'm just doing a visual reference to see, in fact, I did take 1/4 inch off that back. Now I've got a reference on the front. It's the same process. We just touch the cutting edge of the bit to the front, bump the precision stop up against the round bar, move the router away from the precision stop to give me room for whatever size gauge block I want to use, or combination of blocks I want to use, place it in there, and then just bring it back so it's a snug fit. Once I've got it snugged up against the gauge bar, I'm going to go ahead and pull the gauge block out of there, and then I'm going to slide the precision stop up to my new setting and lock it down to 0. Now the space between those two stops represents the distance for the router to travel to take 1/4 inch off both faces of that workpiece. Here I'm going to show you how I set the depth stop using the same gauge blocks that we just used. I'm going to plunge the bit down until it touches the top of my workpiece. Then I'm going to insert the gauge block or the series of gauge blocks that add up to the total of the depth of my mortise. In this case, or the depth of my tenon, in this case I'm using 5/8 of an inch. I put those blocks in there, I then lock my router down to those gauge blocks, and that's all there is to it. I'm now set to cut a depth of 5/8 of an inch. Okay, it's time to make some chips fly. I'm going to start with the initial plunge cut and then pull the router towards me. We'll take a quick look at the precision stops, and you can see as the depth stop on the router comes down into view, and then as I pull the router towards me, I don't have to look at any scales or DRO. The stop will control how far I can go. Now I'm going to traverse the sliding bar and cut the front face of this tenon. Again, I'm not worried about looking at anything, because when I get to the extent of my stop, it's going to force me to stop. Here's what it looks like underneath. The center stop will traverse with the bar and bump against that stop, and that's all the further I can go. Now I'm pushing back, and as you can see, the travel again is controlled by the stop set on the precision stops. I'll cut the rear face of the tenon, and once again I'm not worried about stopping because I can only go as far as the shop stops will allow me. Well, now we've got a tenon cut. It's time to decide whether to round off the tenon or square up the mortise. I like to use a safe edge file and round off the tenons. I find that easier for me. This file happens to be a number 2 bastard cut with, again, a safe edge. It takes me roughly 30 seconds or less to do one of these tenons completely, and that's important to me because I have quite a few to do for the project I'm working on. As you can see, it takes very little time to knock the edge off that corner and blend the radius into the surfaces of the tenon. This is about as easy as it gets. You of course may want to use a chisel and square up the mortises. Either way will work just fine.